Welcome, everyone, to this week's CDAR seminar. I'm Lisa Goldberg, one of CDAR's co-directors, and today it is my extreme pleasure to introduce this talk, Quantum Cities, Data-Centric Approaches for Resilient, Sustainable Cities. Amazing title, amazing concept. We've got two speakers from Swiss Re, Thomas Phillips, Alicia Montoya, coming to you from Zurich, and also associated with this talk is old friend and CDAR founder, Jeff Bond, who's on today, I believe, coming to us from Japan. So quite a reach we have through this wonderful technology. Please feel free. The speakers have said that they're happy to be interrupted or to take questions along the way. So please do that. If you have them, I'll hand off now and mute myself for the moment at least. So Alicia and Thomas, please go ahead.
Thank you. So good morning, San Francisco. Greetings from Zurich, Switzerland. My name is Alicia Montoya. I head up research commercialization at the Swiss Re Institute, which is Swiss Re's R&D unit. Swiss Re is one of the world's largest reinsurers. We insure insurance companies and governments for the big risks like natural catastrophes and life and health risks and other risks like technological risks like cyber. And I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague, Thomas Phillips, who heads up Geo at Swiss Re. We'd actually love to be there in person, but unfortunately the planet is melting. So we apply strict carbon budgets to our travel policy, and therefore we can't be there in person. But we're very happy to be doing this seminar with you. So today we're here to talk about Quantum Cities, which is an R&D program designed to help cities tackle the many challenges and opportunities they face. We'll briefly introduce the concept of the program, and then we'll dive into two of the hairiest challenges that cities face. One of them is urban floods, because in densely packed urban environments, it's very, very difficult to model and therefore predict and cover floods, which is increasingly a problem for cities where a lot of the urban population is gathering, as well as wealth. So urban floods are a big issue. The other one we'll be tackling is supply chain risk quantification and propagation. And this is an issue that has actually been unresolved in the insurance industry for decades. So we're very proud to present a model that we actually co-developed with CDAR that finally solves this problem. So Thomas will show a demo of the urban flood model, and I will focus on business applications of supply chain, which will hopefully shed a little bit of light on how insurance and reinsurance products and services work, and how by using data-centric approaches as well as hybridized machine learning models, we can help insurers do a better job at predicting and preventing risks and helping support sustainable, resilient cities. So with that, let's get started. So first of all, why did we focus on cities? Well, urban development has exploded in recent years, and it is set to continue. So 70% of the world population will live in cities by 2050. Today, there are already more than 35 megacities and more than 10 million people. These, the world's 600 largest cities account for 60% of global GDP. And many of these mega cities are in developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So modeling these risks is challenging because we don't have past data. And so Thomas will take you through how he's overcome this problem for urban risks in these very populous developing cities. Finally, just a note on the actual built environment. So the world will build an entire New York City every month for the next 40 years. So that's a ton of construction, and that can drive a lot of other impacts like sustainability issues like emissions, and of course, all kinds of issues between land, energy, water nexuses. So cities are a huge risk, but they're also a huge opportunity. And if we want to accommodate for these growing populations and to do so by providing the kind of cities that will help humanity survive and prosper, we need intelligent urban planning and solutions that create safe, affordable, green, resilient, and sustainable cities. And this needs to include things like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, helping cities manage disasters like urban floods, reduce environmental impact like water, air, and waste, and of course, significantly reduce deaths and economic losses caused by disasters. However, when we look at a recent UN special progress report that was published late last year, we see that actually there's a number of indicators that show that actually cities are struggling to meet some of those SDG 11 goals. And it's not just SDG 11 that we're trying to solve for, because of course the Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected. So we need to make sure that people have housing and food and clean water and energy. And so all of these risks, as we'll see, are interconnected. And so when we look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, we see that every year it shows the growing interconnectivity of risks and their accumulation across the globe. And so in order to solve for these risks, which can be driven by technological, social, geopolitical, or economic shocks, we need new approaches and tools. And so what we're doing at the Swiss Re Institute and Swiss Re is to use data-driven machine intelligence enhanced approaches to allow us to predict and prevent risks and deliver effective resilience offerings. And so how do we do that? Well, it all starts with entangled data. And this is entangled data to solve entangled risks and to provide entangled opportunities. And so let's start with the definition of quantum entanglement that gave rise to the name quantum cities. So quantum entanglement is a physical phenomenon that occurs when a group of entities and the related data are generated, interact, or share spatial proximity in a way such that the state of each entity of the group cannot be described independently of the state of others, including when the entities are separated by a large distance. And this is exactly what we see when we look at city risks. And so our vision for quantum cities is to ensure and insure safe, resilient, sustainable cities by developing modular, data-driven, end-to-end sustainable urban models, analytics, and insurance offerings that enable cities to grow sustainably, to better manage their risk exposures, and to help authorities prevent, manage, and quickly bounce back from risks and losses like those we mentioned, from climate change, from cyber risks, etc. And so what's exciting about these new data-driven approaches is that we're really enabling a very important shift in the insurance industry. And that's really from moving from after the fact risk protection. So you have an event, you have a loss, you claim, and then you get your insurance payment back, to prediction and prevention to avoid the loss in the first place. And of course, if I asked you, what would you prefer? Would you like me to pay you after your house burned down, or would you prefer me to avoid your house burning down? I'm sure you would prefer the latter. And so this is really where we think it's where the industry needs to go. And when we talk about insurance, it's really around moving from, again, after the fact protection products towards a combination of analytics and risk management to provide resilience as a service. And we'll look at examples of what those services can look like. So the program, Quantum Cities, looks at some of the key verticals that impact cities in a holistic way. And so we've divided them into four kind of verticals, which in themselves are already a combination of risks. So when you look at an insurer's business, they would typically, within supply chain, they would have several verticals. We've already pulled those into supply chain, into environment and natural catastrophes, into mobility and green industry, and into societal resilience and health. And you can see some examples of the kind of challenges, but also opportunities that you can solve for when you take this entangled data and you solve across these different risks and opportunities. And I'll give you an example on the health side. So people always ask me, why is diabetes there? Well, actually, diabetes can be exacerbated by lack of exercise. But of course, if you're building a city that is livable and that helps people, or that provides green spaces for people to move, that can actually lower your risk of diabetes. So your city planning can have an impact on your health. Of course, other examples are, for example, clean transport in cities, which are already, transportation and energy production are already causing lots of emissions and pollution, which is already responsible for 20% of deaths. So these things are very interconnected, and by looking at them holistically, we can help really reduce risks across the board and develop the kind of cities that we all want to live in and thrive in. And so today we'll look specifically at ensuring supply chain continuity and urban floods, which are two of the aspects within this broader program. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to decompose the challenge into specific questions to solve for. And some of those questions are around, what happens when a new risk, like for example, when we introduce autonomous vehicles in cities, and how can that be done in an optimal way? Or how are my risks accumulating? And of course, the two that we will tackle today, how can we model urban floods, and how can I make my supply chain more resilient? Once you've captured the questions that you're trying to solve for and the technologies that can help you solve them, which are at the bottom, then we can move into looking at the kind of risk pools and solutions that insurers and reinsurers can then develop and participate in. And so if we start at the bottom, we look at how new technologies like 5G, distributed ledgers, Internet of Things, machine intelligence can then help us look at these risks and assets and events in a way that is contextualized, and we'll look at how we build these hybridized models to enable virtual and physical models that can then help us apply that to our risk knowledge to then solve for resilient people, a resilient economy, and a resilient environment. And so really within this program, what we're looking at is developing new risk pools and offerings to help cities make the best out of resources, make the best out of opportunities, and of course, mitigate negative impacts. And so when we look, for example, at the increase in interconnected systems and dependence on tech, this can result in efficiencies, but it can also create new exposures like supply chain business interruption, risks, and propagation. So we'll look at that in terms of connected trade. Another example would be, the increase in AI-powered algorithms and connected devices, and digital health services can result in better life and health offerings, but it can also increase exposures to systemic risks like algorithmic risks, cyber risks, etc. So these are great opportunities, but they also represent new risks for the insurance and reinsurance industry. But if we can better use new data, so beyond the data that insurers have traditionally gotten from their cedents, we can now enhance that data with new big data, Internet of Things data, sensor data, and Thomas will be giving great examples of how we're doing that for urban flood. With that new data combined with our insurance data, we can then start developing very exciting new products and services like risk scores and indexes, like data services that we can, deliver as APIs into whatever client platform. We can deliver end-to-end risk platforms. We can develop resilience analytics, and we'll look at those in the context of supply chain. And of course, we can also develop risk studies around, for example, comparing the trade-offs in terms of urban measures or economics of climate adaptation measures, climate impact studies, transition scenarios, etc. So once we have that rich data connected, in terms of these virtual models together with, or what Jeff calls physics-aware models, then we can really start simulating urban scenarios and enabling the optimization across multiple parameters. So how do we do that? Modeling cities is difficult, but if we are able to overcome the challenges, we can develop these exciting opportunities. And I want to credit Jeff Boehm for this content, which I will do my best to do justice to. So thanks to new data, advanced algorithms, and powerful computational tools, we're now able to, as I mentioned earlier, combine physical and virtual modeling, systems modeling like never before. And what this means is we can now build these hybrid algorithms that enable us to better model the risks in real environments. And so modeling has come a long, long way, where it started its humble beginnings in the 80s with some very basic models. And then as we advanced into 3D component design and then holistic models, we were able to have a much more systems-based modeling approach. And now since 2015 or so, we are able to develop these hybridized machine learning models that can then allow us to combine virtual and physical worlds, which then enable us to do the kind of risk modeling and simulations that we will look at later in the use cases. What's critical here is that we are now able to pull in data from many different sources and curate it, integrate it into these models in order to give us much richer understanding of the kind of different layers that impact these dense, entangled environments and risks. And so through these approaches, we are able to combine these models and machine learning that allow reinsurers to uncover hidden entanglements, which, as we mentioned earlier, can be risks, but also opportunities. And by having that view where one same data set can inform understandings around buildings, around power networks, around waterways, around all kinds of dependent physical infrastructure, we can then start better modeling and then offering solutions that can be offered via scalable software as a service platforms that can then enable monetization across many different ways, like we looked at earlier in terms of data services and platform offerings. Great. And so, as I said, if you think of the physical footprint of a city, you have the transit system, the water system, the utility system, and all of these infrastructures. Think of an event like an earthquake. Several of these infrastructures can then be interrupted. And so by having a digital footprint, so this digital twin that we've now created, which is a virtual version of this real world, informed by the real world, we are now able to get a risk footprint of the city and therefore do all kinds of analytics like seismic impact analysis, like flood impact analysis. And you'll see a very cool version of that with Thomas later. And then, of course, not just enable better insurance products, but actually also, as we said earlier, help authorities, urban authorities, build more resilient systems. And you've heard the term before, build back better. So we are learning from these losses, and we're trying to build better systems. You will see in all kinds of urban environments, as the risk of flood rises, we're seeing better and better water management strategies. If you've ever visited Rotterdam, it's actually incredible because it's a very, very flat city. Most of the Netherlands, I mean, Netherlands literally means low country, and most of the Netherlands is at water, sea level or lower. And and thanks to water management, they're able to withstand and bounce back from floods in incredible ways. And they have all kinds of so half of the city becomes a water drainage system and pools when there's a flood. So there's many things that you can do once you have this digital footprint of a city to optimize your resources and to reduce your losses. And so these physics-based resilience models can then help insurers develop these new offerings. So once we have the physical infrastructure layer, the risk exposure layer, and the financial layer, and that's a critical one because before, we need to be able to translate those physical and risk layers into potential losses and exposures so that we can then develop products and services against those potential losses. And so you can do this on risk resilience platforms and then offer all kinds of offerings like risk intelligence, accumulation control, loss prediction, of course, real-time warnings, et cetera, to help cedents predict and prevent risks as much as they can, react faster to risks as they're happening, and then bounce back faster from risks after they've happened. So think of early warning systems before. So if there's a flood or then, early warning systems to help you manage your belongings, bring them back from the basement and basically minimize the losses before, then during, evacuate, make sure that everybody's safe, make the best use of resources. And then after, maybe you can develop things like a parametric product to help people immediately get a cash out payment based on a trigger. For example, if there's X millimeters of rain that have fallen, then you automatically get X dollars so that you can immediately pay for temporary accommodation, make sure you get a new car so that you can go to work, so to avoid that you kind of fall through the cracks and then you have a huge financial burden that you can never really bounce back from.
So a question about that.
Sure.
So I see the advantages of having the payments triggered by some objectively measurable event like the amount of rainfall, and it avoids the necessity to see what the losses are on an individual basis. So I understand those benefits. On the other hand, it also seems to distribute the payments to people who may not have been damaged and then potentially lower the payments for people who've really had high damages. So I'm wondering one should think about that trade-off.
Yeah, so this is still a space that is developing because of exactly what you're saying. So there are several things that you can do, and we are getting better and better. And you'll see from Thomas's presentation, for example, how we're now able to measure, for example, urban flood in a much more granular way. Whereas before, the models would probably have led you to not granular enough data to actually know have you had a loss or not. But I'll give you a few examples of how we're looking at this. First of all, we typically offer parametric products in conjunction with indemnity products where desired, because of course there's still the basis risks. So the way I like to think of this is you still have your indemnity insurance product, but that can take longer to pay out. And so you have like a little top up that pays out straight away in terms of a parametric product to get you to the next, to get you through the next few weeks. And then you still have your indemnity product that is actually going to cover the loss. So that's the first thing, is I see them as complementary, not one or the other. The second thing about the actual loss, so for example, one of the things you can do is have a double trigger. So for example, you can have satellite imagery that looks at you were in the area that was heavily impacted by an earthquake, by a flood, and then you can ask for a second proof of loss. For example, a picture of your lounge, which is also geolocated. So I know you're in the right area, and I can see the picture of your lounge, and that would serve as a kind of proof of loss. So these are different approaches that we're looking at, and of course, sensor data is getting better and better. And Thomas can talk a lot more about that.
Thank you very much for the handover, and Bob, I'll actually go into what your last question in a moment, because there's quite a bit to what you just asked. Now, one of the reasons why we have pulled out, or why we have started to look at flood as one of the key perils that we wanted to look at as this part of this quantum city setup, is because flood represents quite a large amount of secondary peril losses. That means secondary perils are not the big ones like tropical cyclones or earthquake. It's the more minor, more local ones, such as landslide or flood. And where, as what you just mentioned before, the problem is that if you want to do a parametric setup, as what Alicia said, you might really have the case that one house is actually hit by the flood and the next house isn't, because no two floods look exactly the same. So the question is, how do you deal with that? Now, when you look at, I have to pull this over so I can see my own slide. When you look at how it's been developing over time, you can see that the increase of events or of losses has actually been increasing. Now, if you move back for a moment and think of insurance, insurance is actually a very, very simple mathematical equation. All you do is you have to know what's the probability of something going to happen. You take that, you calculate it, and you get your premium based on the amount that your asset is worth. The problem is that one of the major things that you assume when you have that is that you're in a steady state, because statistics are typically done over 30 years. And anyone who works in statistics knows that anything that happens in the natural world is usually not in a steady state. And this doesn't necessarily mean climate change. This also means that we have a higher population. People are moving into areas which are less safe. It's really cool to live on the beach. A beach or a cliffside has never been actually a safe place to have a house, but it's just one of those things which we can do with better building and with the assets that we have at hand. So it's not just that climate change or something like that is occurring. It's also that we have got inflation, we've got population growth, and we've got luxury to move into certain places. And so one of the key things that we do in insurance, and in particular in my team as the geo team, is we try to figure out how much an event that happened a while ago would actually cost today with today's infrastructure and with today's value of property. And also, and this is the key thing, humans are very resilient. We usually learn from mistakes that we have made, how that actually impacts the setup. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, you will notice that in New Orleans, more people are living there than when Katrina occurred. Inflation has gone up, but they have actually also become better on the resilient side. So the levees, there are more levees in place, and they are actually better. They are more safe for certain events. So in a Katrina, no matter what, wouldn't happen the same way again. Now, as we move forward,
Thomas,
yes, go ahead.
got a question on the previous, two questions on the previous slide.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, there's a big spike there around 2011 or something.
Yes.
What's that?
So 2011 was first of all, it was a very massively high tropical cyclone year. So there was a lot of tropical cyclones. And the second reason was in the US, it was actually a very dry year. But in Europe, it was a very, very damp year. So it was one of the biggest flood years that we actually have on record. So when you look at the colorings, you'll notice that the blue area here, that's the flood. So that's, and if you compare it to all of the dark blue, if you compare it to all of the other years, it's the biggest flood, amount of flood that we've seen in the past.
Okay. Second question is, what are the units on the y-axis? Sorry if I'm missing something. Goes up to 80.
That's losses in estimated in $1 billion.
In billions of dollars.
Yes, global.
And then final question, I'm sure this one's unanswerable, but just when you look at a trend like that, of course, our ability to collect information has changed over the time, and climate change has become more of a problem. And I wonder if you could just say anything about the elements of that upward trend, how much of it is this thing and how much of it is that thing. Maybe too hard, but
good point. It's a large. So this is, as I said, as I mentioned, there's no correction for inflation in it, because we are looking at as it from an insurance perspective, what the actual value is, the actual losses that we've done. Globally speaking, there's an approximate inflation rate, because a lot of the richer countries have better insurance. It's approximately 1%. So you've definitely got that trend in it. Then the second thing which you also notice is that you have more buildings being built. That's the second one. And the third one is, and that's the awareness part, is people actually realize that they might be at risk, so they get insurance. That is one of the things, that's one of the biggest growing one that you can't see in this figure, but people are actually starting to insure themselves. If you take Australia, it was 2 years ago, they had floods where the depth of the flood water was 5 meters, so 15 feet. Is that correct? Yes, I think about 15 feet. So if you were on the second floor of the building, where you usually wouldn't have to have flood insurance, people are beginning to think, maybe I should take out the flood insurance too, because you could be hit even if you're not on the base floor. So these are all trends that you're beginning to see. People are trying to get these kinds of insurances moving forward.
thank you.
You're welcome. So moving forward, what we can see is that basically more and more places are going to be affected by floods. And what we can also see, and that isn't the surprise, the area where the biggest amount of loss is going to happen, or where we expect it is in Southeast or Southern Asia, and that's also where the highest density of population lives. As we know, currently the insurance market is much bigger in the US and in Europe, because that's where people typically have insurance. So moving forward, again, if you think of it in a steady state, it would be nice if you would have evenly distributed risks all over the globe. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen, because more people live in the Northern Hemisphere. There's more land in the Northern Hemisphere. So the potential that people are actually going to be affected in the Northern Hemisphere or in certain regions is much greater. So all of these kinds of setups make it very lopsided, and it tells us that we really have to start to think, go into not just looking at it from a portfolio level, meaning as a global problem, but we actually have to go into looking at individual cities. That's where the quantum city comes from, but also individual houses, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to the individual location. So what we wanted to do is, and comes from the background of how we look at floods. Flood modeling or probabilistic modeling is actually set up in such a way, and I'll just talk a little more in the next slide, is that you actually simulate a physical process. Now, what we wanted to do with this was we wanted to come up with a different approach, which is a scalable that you can actually learn from learnings in one location and actually use it in a different location, because we have a lot of data, say for San Francisco or New York, but we don't really have very much for Accra or Lagos or Jakarta, places like that, because historically speaking, people haven't been insured and we don't know what the actual damage was in those places. The second thing is we wanted to be able to do it for a lot of different natural factors. So we want to be able to get an idea what climate change could have, what kind of an impact that could have, and other extreme patterns such as rainfall, which is drastically increasing. The third one I already mentioned is the human factor. Floods in cities are not so much nowadays an issue due to actual water or precipitation. It's got more to do with the fact that the water cannot run off, or that people let their waste lie outside in the gutter where the actual water would run off, and the soil, due to the building up and the concrete streets and things like that, the water cannot penetrate into the soil. So naturally, it starts to collect in lower areas. And the last one is, and this is really, really key as well, is we wanted to be able to have something that we can actually analyze and discuss with clients what their damage potentially could be, but also that we have an idea, and this goes into the basis risk that Alicia was talking about. Basis risk is nothing different than the uncertainty or the wrong assumptions that you made, that we could actually quantify those. Besides that, there are some other real basic problems that we have to go into. And that is how we actually map the globe. And that's already where the digital twin that Alicia was talking about actually gets to have some problems. On the left side, I have got 3 different providers of building footprints, and they all tell me, if you go through their paperwork, that their accuracy is better than 1 foot. So if you look at it, you can notice that the buildings are in totally different places, and some of them have even very different shapes. The reason is the way that these buildings obviously were actually digitized. Some of them come from a survey, others are from satellite imagery. You have a lot of differences in it. So you actually have to know what you're looking at. The second one is on the right side is geocoding. So basically putting a Latin long to an address. And that one includes 5 different providers. Every color is a different one. And when you look at them, then you realize that if you start to actually reduce everything to a single point, it becomes very, very difficult if you're not using the same point to make sure that you're actually talking of the same object. So if you take these things into consideration, you start to realize that quantum cities is a really good project, but the basis risk can be very, very damaging, because there's so many small issues where you could actually increase risk by misunderstandings. So that's a really, really key factor when we start thinking of it. Now, going further, we took up the global, I'll talk about floods. There are different kinds of floods, and this is really key for you to understand, because they're based on physical processes. There's so-called pluvial, and there's which means rain-based floods. There's fluvial, which is river or displacement-based floods, such as if you've got snowfall in the Rocky Mountains or in the Sierras, it moves down the river as it melts, and you get floods because of that. Now, that's a very clear physical process that you can simulate. But it's really hard to simulate is the actual loss or the actual impact it has on a city. And when we did this for Cairo, for instance, where we have very little data, you can see the projection is for pluvial is very small, for fluvial is bigger. The areas that we were interested in are those in red. We looked at the same thing for Durban. Again, you can see it's very little. But what was key was that the risk people from our insurance companies actually said, hey, we can't actually see the losses in these maps that you're showing. Why is that? So as we move forward, you have to be aware that actually when you talk about risk or flood risk, there are two components to it. On the one hand, you've got the flood risk, which means the actual risk that you have water accumulating. And that's based on elevation, slope, the river network, distance to rivers, things like that. And at the same time, you have the vulnerability of the building. And this is really key because that is very, very much down to human impact or how humans behave. That's how they've built their buildings, how far apart they are, whether they've got levees, things like that. And when you bring these two things together, then at the end of the day, you actually have the so-called flood risk. And that's the basis of anything that we do. So in order to actually tackle that, we came up with a model, and I very simplified it. On the one hand, we get a lot of different layers that we pull in, data sets that are used as basics for our modeling. So we actually take an ML-based or a deep learning-based approach, and we do it as a supervised model. What we did was we took a ton based on what I just said before, these different layers. We take elevation, we take slope, we take river networks, and we pull all of those data sets. And the same thing on the socio-economical side. So we look, where do the rich people live? Where do the poor people live? Kinds of things like that. And we overlay that, we stack it. At the end of the day, we have 28 different layers on top of each other. And because we know what we're looking for, and that's the flood, and we measure the flood on the basis of how much loss we've made, we can actually do that as a supervised model. And that's exactly the approach that we took. So what we did was we took openly available data sets for the model training, and we started in one city and we went to the next and to the next and to the next. And in doing so, we actually had the benefit of the model learning as it was going as we were going from one place to the next. Because the nice thing is that flood is a physical process at the end of the day, and water accumulation behaves the same way in all different locations. So when we started the whole project, we started in Mexico. And as Bob asked before, right in the beginning, we had the problem that Mexico City was set up in such a way that actually the whole city that you can see on the right side was one price. And after 10 years, the company realized that we were making a loss. And the reason that we were making a loss was because obviously the risk was not the same all over the place. But by paying out taking the same assumption, what happened was that people because we took an average risk for all of the whole area, when you looked at the areas up here where there's low risk, people didn't get the insurance because it was considered to be too expensive. And in areas down here where there's a high risk because it was basically under-evaluated, you had the problem that you had more people buying it because we were probably cheaper than everyone else. So in changing this landscape, we could actually start to analyze the risk. And again, this was not, if you compare it to the previous ones, it has some kind of similarity to what you can see, but what you can see very, very clearly is that the impact that taking the socio-economical issues such as income, as size of buildings, things like that, has a clear impact. And it became a much, much more resilient and much better insurance product. When you go further to Cairo, which I showed before, we did the same thing, and these here are the points that it was based on. And what you can see is that the points that we have over here, they're all in this area, but we were able to start to model areas to the east of this as well, just because they have the same physical properties as the areas where we actually have the data for. And the same thing could be said when we moved into a place such as Durban. So the model was learning as we were going from one place to the next. And actually, when we went back to Mexico after having done the other two cities, we realized that it had learned again, and the results became better again. So humans, cities have got a lot of similarity, and you can actually start to move it from one place to the next. So in next steps, as we continue this, we are very convinced that we can actually start to do this for other perils as well, because that's what we think is going to be needed. So now so far we've only done it for the darker blue areas for the flood, but we really want to start. We've done the first approaches to do it for wildfires. We are looking at it for severe convective storms as well, and we are actually hoping that we can be able to offer better insurance moving forward. Now, when you think of that, it's not just about insurance, because at the end of the day, people prefer not to lose their house at all than to get an insurance payout. So what we are actually trying to do is to make people aware of what it is and what kind of next steps they could take to actually become more resilient in the first place, because then the insurance costs actually go down and you can actually start to insure it. So if you are in California, then, and you know that you're at wildfire risk, there are certain measures that you can take. And that's just a teaser. I could give you the information what to do in another talk, but that might be good for another day. And the other thing which we do is, because we were able to do it for Mexico City and for two places in Africa, Cairo and Durban, in places where we explicitly know that there's not as much data around to validate what we have done, we believe that we can start to take this and take learnings from one city and do it for others. So we have a list of next cities that we are going to do. And we are also looking at various continents, because there are differences between cities in different countries. And I mean, you just know that Los Angeles is very different than the Bay Area, for instance, just from the architecture and how it's built. So there are definitely things that we can learn on there. So with that, I would hand back to Alicia Montoya. What you are going to see in a moment is a video of how we actually do, how short it takes to actually run this model to do a risk assessment for a location. It was built, the model was built entirely by our team. It was built together with the background, or the data sets are all openly available and were pulled through Google Earth Engine. That's why you will hear that we did it quite a bit of it together with Google. So actually, with the exception of the model which we wrote, you can actually go ahead and replicate it. And I mean, because you can get access to the data. It is really essential for us, as part of the resilient thought, that you actually know that we were not playing with any hidden data sets, but that it's actually really data sets that you can go and find and pull yourself. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and I'll ask Alicia to play the movie.
Start by zooming in and defining our region of interest, within which we want
Can you hear it?
Predict flood probability. For
Yes.
that, we'll
Perfect.
specify the greater Manhattan area and start pre-processing the data on Google Earth Engine. So we are sending this particular region to Google Earth Engine, selecting a total of 28 data sets, all coming from their data catalog, and we are matching all of those data sets so that they are perfectly overlapping. In a second step, we download the data out of Google Earth Engine into the virtual machine on which we are running this particular notebook. Of course, this is not optimal because it's copying data around. It would be better to run the notebook within Google's environment. So in the next step, we take our data sets and we create 6 different features that we can now input into our model. So what we actually did in the third step is to create a 3-dimensional data cube in which the first 2 dimensions are longitude and latitude, so space, and the third dimension are the different features. If we now run the model, we can see that it is pretty fast, and we classified a bit more than 110,000 individual pixels in this particular region of interest. We now quickly save our result to GeoTIFF format and we visualize it. So this last step of visualization usually takes the most time, and the reason for that is that the map you see here is actually connected to Google Earth Engine and not to the virtual machine where I'm running this. And this in turn means that we have to upload the features and the flood probability map we just created to Google Earth Engine first, before we can actually display it. Again, with a better setup where everything is run from within Google's environment, this would be a lot more performant. I will already get rid of our region of interest because we're almost there. Yes. So we can already see that we are displayed with our flood probability map that we created. Again, this is coming from Google Earth Engine, which makes it sometimes a bit slow when updating the tiles, but we should get there soon. Yes, here we go. And if you wanted, we could also look at the different features we used to predict, for example, the elevation model or the derived slope layer or topographic wetness index. We start by
certainly beautiful.
And
Perfect.
Good. So just quickly as an information before you ask questions, the model, this was not fully calibrated, but the learnings which were used now on the Manhattan is actually all learnings which came out of already the Mexico City, the Durban, and the Cairo. So as we are moving forward, it really, you learn and you take it to the next step. So with that, I would open for any questions that you would have to my side, or obviously to Alicia as well, in connection to this.
Certainly very beautiful and very impressive. So this is a machine learning model,
yes,
of some sort with a lot of, how many parameters are in it?
So the different parameters in this one, which we had, as my colleague Tim said, were 28 different ones, but we are looking at various other parameters. So there are different layers, the parameter layers. Obviously, you've got hidden layers which are then created. So you've got super parameters which have to be trained as well. But
Yeah.
the actual input layers that we have are 28.
Okay, so I was wondering, like, when I think of ChatGPT, it has 60 billion parameters. We're
Yes.
not talking about that. Okay.
Well,
Uh,
actually, so if you go into that, if you think of it as a neural network, yes, then every single pixel is
Yeah,
obviously one. So then it's he said it was 128,000 pixels in it. So it would be 128,000 times 28.
okay. Still
Those were the
small
neurons.
compared to ChatGPT, but it sounds like a lot
Yes.
to me.
Yes. Correct.
So my question then is, you're doing this is like a supervised learning
Yes.
kind of thing. So
Yes.
how are you testing it? I mean, how do you divide your data into
So
a test and a set?
absolutely, that's a very good point. So there are two ways that we've done it. First of all, we have been partnering with other and not with other, but with NGOs who have an estimation, or the World Bank keeps records, for instance, on what damage is. And we actually prefer to do it with those kinds of estimations because there are no insurance structures on it. So the loss which is given is the absolute loss. So that was put in. What we then use is so we use that for the training as the training data.
Mhm.
And what we took as our secret ingredient, because that's our knowledge, for testing, we then take our own loss knowledge that we have. So that is where that's our Swiss Re's secret ingredient when we bring that in, because we know that's how it's done. So they are two totally independent sets of data. We know that the model was not trained on any historic data that Swiss Re has.
Got it. Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
Just one quick point which I wanted to point out, just because of that. That's why it's interesting, we can actually, when we talk to people, we can actually start sharing that. We don't have to go to an insurer and say, hey guys, we trained this on our Swiss Re knowledge, which we are not willing to share with you. We can actually go and say, hey guys, this is how we do it. Okay, it's our model, and we obviously don't want to share all of the details there, but the data sets are out there.
No, that's very cool. So, so let me open up to the audience for questions.
So I've got a question about the business model. First of all, I think this is an immensely impressive and quite valuable product. Commercially, potentially in terms of reducing losses, and so providing a public benefit in addition to its private benefit. So Swiss Re's clients are primary insurers. And my question is, are you selling this to your clients, or are you providing it, free to your clients? The information also affects your negotiation with the client. So when you sit down and give a bid for reinsurance to, let's say, Allstate, that negotiation is clearly affected by the knowledge on both sides. So I guess I'm asking, what's the business model in terms of giving this away or selling it, and to whom, and if possible, how did you arrive at that strategy? So it's a long and difficult question, and there may also be some proprietary issues there that you may not be able to share. But I'm wondering what you can tell us about those decisions.
So yes, it's actually one of the motivations why I'm even in this business, to be honest with you. So, and I could go on for hours on this. One of the key things that we've learned in insurance is people don't trust insurance because people say you never pay. And that has got to do with various different models. So, but what we then started to realize is that there are not everything, but there are certain things which is really, really helpful to share knowledge on with your clients. For instance, when we do a risk lookup, that's why I showed the geocodes and the building footprints at the beginning, is That is something that we absolutely share with our clients, because we want them to know exactly which locations that we took to actually analyze their risk. So that's really key, because if you have a farm in the US, for instance, which is massively big, and you take a single location, it could be the building, but it could also be your letterbox down at the road, which might be 600 yards away. And if you're talking about flood, that's a different universe. So it's really key that we are very clear with them there. The second thing which we do is, we don't like to give single points, but what we are willing to share are patterns. So for instance, when you have a footprint of a certain event, we will show them the pattern and people start to recognize it, because you can see that there's more damage closer to the river, for instance, than further away. So we have our own classification models, so that you can also share, you can also compare risks. That's one key thing, and we're willing to share that with people. So it goes from 0 to 10. Basically, we will tell the person, look, you're exposed to wildfire and flood. One, you have a 5, and the other you have a 7. So the bigger risk is the 7, which is the 10, but that's more so that people can actually have that index. So we're willing to do that. The part which we are clearly not willing to share is the super parameters that we have trained for the model. Because that is an advantage that we have at the moment, and as a result, that part. But what we are willing to do is the training data, to share where we have the training data from, and also what we can do on with this model. And going forward, you know, it's a model, it's a mathematical approach. That is something that that can be, at some point, it's going to be replicated anyway. So it's there. We have realized that in a lot of cases, it really makes sense to share certain things.
Great, thank you.
Actually, Thomas, I've got a question. To what extent have you tested the model on Swiss Re data?
We tested it. So the locations that you saw, 3, no, the 4. Mexico City, Durban, and Cairo, they were obviously all done for a purpose, because there was an interest either by us or by a client. So that's why we took those. So those were actually tested with data sets that we had access to.
Yeah. And actually, I want to make sure Alicia has time for the supply chain, so maybe we can move to that.
Perfect. So let's jump back to the presentation. And thank you for the great questions. Clearly, you share our passion for entangled risks and data-driven hybridized models, which is fantastic. All right, so let me fast forward through supply chain business interruption risk quantification. You may have encountered this because we co-developed this with CDAR. And so Hubei Gudogan presented this at a previous CDAR seminar. So if you did, if you were at that seminar, you're probably familiar with the model. As I mentioned, I'm going to focus more on the business applications of the model rather than the model itself. And I'm going to go quite quickly through the first slide so that we spend enough time on the actual applications. So first of all, global supply chains are increasingly global, digital, interconnected, and specialized. And so what we're seeing is that risk can accumulate across all these different drivers, operational, network, financial, and reflect on insurers' losses, but also corporates and people. And so in order to build supply chain resilience, we actually require an understanding of the supply chain nodes within a network and then the networks of the networks, and then the interdependencies, so that we can then calculate business interruption risks and the potential for risk propagation and accumulation. Because we have, and actually, if you've been reading the news, the Houthis have been attacking shipments this year. Last year, we had a number of supply chain interruptions as well, driven by either natural catastrophes, droughts, geopolitical events, you name it, we've had it. Pandemics the previous 2 years. So many different things can disrupt the supply chain, and it's costing billions in losses globally. And so this is one of those hairy topics that the insurance industry has been wrestling with for decades. And so in order to be able to quantify the financial losses, we need to understand the dynamics of these networks and interdependencies. And so the first thing we need to know is which locations in a portfolio are dependent on others, which products are supplied to those dependent locations, which companies supply those products, what is the relative scarcity or risk of those products or suppliers? Is there one supplier? Are there several? How can the business interruption propagate? Where are the locations? And then attribute financials to the different dependencies, so that we can then understand, when we overlay with, for example, a natural catastrophe like Thomas's urban flood, that we then understand how that's going to propagate across the supply chain, and therefore what is that going to mean in terms of financial exposures and losses. And then with that information, we can then look at how can we develop different products and services, as we looked at earlier, resilience products, early warnings, but also, for example, parametric covers on, for example, business interruption. So if I used to work at Alstom, if my power plant is down for a day, that's $1 million. And so imagine if it's not just one power plant, but a whole network. And so this is where you really start seeing the very big risks accumulate and propagate. And so risk can aggregate across many different aspects. So let's look at automotive supply chains, as they're a classic example of a complex supply chain. So first of all, you have supplier aggregation. So you can have bottlenecks within a supplier, and we'll look at that in a second. You can also have geographic aggregation. We saw that with the Thai floods, where suddenly a lot of the same components were built in a relatively small area, that when hit by a flood, basically took out supply chains globally. You have industry aggregation, shipping, finance, etc. And so these can lead to insurance losses, both physical losses, but also profit losses. And so this is really where we focus. So business interruption is a business interruption at a specific location. Contingent business interruption is a dependent location suffering from a dependent physical interruption. And then non-damage is where it's not a property damage, but it's maybe a financial loss. So these are the three types of business interruption insurance products that we can offer. But in order to offer them, we need to be able to price them. And in order to price them, we need to be able to understand them, i.e. model them. And so it's very difficult to model things that you don't understand because you can't see. So for example, in complex supply chains like GM, only 5% of the suppliers are in tier 1, and that's typically the tier where you have visibility. Anything that's beyond tier 1, so tier 2 to tier N, you typically don't even know, because it's somebody supplying to somebody, supplying to somebody, supplying to somebody, who eventually brings all these products together into whatever they're supplying to you. And so when you look at cars, you probably gonna have no idea who supplied the elements within the motherboard that then went into the component provider that then built this, built in the software that then put it into the car. And so this is the problem, is that the visibility is not there. And so when we look at, for example, the supply chain of a typical automotive company, we see that it's in this very brittle diamond shape. And the problem is that typically, because of the specialization that we spoke about earlier, for example, in terms of manufacturers of wafers and chips, there's actually very few. making them for everyone in the world. And so when you have something like a geopolitical instability, for example, in Taiwan, that can affect supply chains globally. And then suddenly you start seeing lead times for, I don't know if you've tried to buy a car recently, but for the last few years, we've had lead times of over a year. Why? Because the basic components, the foundational components of these computer systems are all being built in the same area that when disrupted, affects the whole world. And so what we did to develop this model was, the first thing is we used external data to enrich Swiss Re data in order to understand the network and the dependencies. The second thing we did was then to model what the probability of loss was at each of the locations, and then the dependencies with the different locations. And we looked at these different aspects that we talked about earlier: single source suppliers, relationships, locations, and of course overlay that with our natural catastrophe models in order to understand what is the physical risk and then how might that propagate. And so what we did was we start from the right, from the original kind of raw material manufacturers, and we can drive through the financials down to the end product. And so by applying a probability of loss, we can understand what the financial exposures are. And then if there is a disruption, we will know which sites are disrupted and how that might affect the end product. And so we tested this, and we basically took an automotive supply chain manufacturer's location data, and we applied an event, a Japan earthquake, the Osaka 2018 earthquake. And so we applied the event onto this manufacturer's locations. And out of 401 locations, we found that 58 were impacted by the Osaka 2018 earthquake. What's more interesting is that there were 9 additional locations that were affected because of the 58. So because of these 58 locations that were impacted, there were an additional 9 that could not provide the products that it was meant to provide, which caused this contingent business interruption loss of an additional 11%. And that is huge. And this is the kind of risk that is actually hidden, because if you don't know how these locations are dependent, you would typically only calculate the exposure based on a single location and not how previous dependent locations might impact it. And so this is how it looked like on the map. And so this is where you can see that at the bottom, we had the 58 directly impacted locations, plus the 9 supply chain indirectly impacted locations, creating additional losses of 13.4 million. And so what we are working on is in order to improve the data, so as to improve the models, so as to be able to improve our products and services, we really start from a bottom-up approach, where we internally, we enrich internal data with these external data. And then through that, we are able to produce underwriting relevant metrics, dependencies, redundancies, emissions, which then allow us to do property business interruption and contingent business interruption quantification, which allow us to then map non-business interruption exposures, which then allow us to understand risks of BI, CBI, and NDBI across the board. And if you look on the left, there's a data virtuous cycle, because the more bottom-up data we can get, the more we understand corporate risk, the better we can understand insurance risk, the better we can understand reinsurance risk, the better we can manage our own group exposures and accumulation and allocate underwriting capital accordingly. And so if we look at this from an analytical point of view, we start with our own data. So these are property exposure data or third-party data. We then, the R&D is really focused around sourcing the different data sources, curating them, integrating them, building the models, plugging the model gaps in order to develop some of these analytics. And of course, we work with partners like CDAR in order to review and compare the state-of-the-art network models and develop new models that, as I said, solve problems that have eluded the insurance industry for decades. And then finally, with that data and analytics, you can then develop the kind of risk engineering approaches that Thomas also mentioned, but also the BI and CBI products, and of course, improve our own underwriting. And Bob, you had a question earlier about, how do we then price these things? This is basically a combination of understanding the risk and then, of course, positioning it within the market. And we have soft and hard cycles that, depending on how many events, so how many losses we've had, that will lead to higher risk to kind of compensate. Or if there's been a low loss years, then the prices will come down. So really, it's about building on this virtuous data cycle from the bottom up. So and then enabling better underwriting bottom up. So at the single risk level, thanks to better data models, we can improve our costing and risk selection. So as Thomas was saying, once we understand what that map looks like, we can then really fine tune where we can't. So, look at California, or Florida. There are areas that are no longer insurable because the prices would just be too high. So we will select risk. We will select the ones that we like, that we don't like, and we will be able to price accordingly. We will be able to develop new products and expand insurability where previously we didn't have enough data. At portfolio level, we can steer portfolios. We can balance upside, downside, and impact. We can grow portfolios, implement risk management strategies, and at group level, we can identify accumulation drivers, manage risk globally, and effectively allocate our underwriting capital. So the typical personas that can benefit from this are risk insurance managers, supply chain managers, procurement managers, and it's all about helping them understand their supply chain and their critical locations. What are those drivers? Can they avoid them? Can they build redundancies? Can they build supplies? Can they build stocks? What are the kind of resilience measures that they can take in order to then reduce the exposures and the vulnerabilities? And so it's all about providing the visibility in terms of the digital twin, in terms of the risk insights, helping cedents find alternative suppliers, understanding where those hotspots are, and then developing the analytics and covers to help them mitigate and manage and bounce back from those risks. So in summary, at the nexus of technology, economic, and societal changes lie untapped opportunities. The breadth and depth of challenges require new approaches to sustainably accelerate growth and manage new risks. Swiss Re's Quantum Cities is a strategic response enabling innovative risk approaches and offerings to increase resilience and close protection gaps. And we work in strategic partnerships with research applied to large-scale transformational projects where reinsurers can support urban and national strategic visions that enable resilient, sustainable economies and societies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys, for one thing, an absolute tour de force. Of course, it's a huge pleasure and very validating for me personally to see academic research be put to such practical and interesting use. So that last bit was fantastic. We are about out of time, so I'm going to be following up with you guys with questions over email. And can we post your beautiful slides on the website and the recording?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So we will be doing that. I want to especially thank everyone who dialed in from an inconvenient time zone, and thank you for accommodating it and making it easy for us here in California. And just want to mention next week, our very own Shakar Kariv will be presenting, so please watch for announcements. So let's thank our speakers. It's really fantastic. Great day, everyone, and hope to see many of you at a CDAR seminar soon.